Hello, everyone. Welcome to Plenary 2. I think most people are here, and if they're not, they're having an extended lunch. We will do our best to try and keep you awake in this post-lunch session. My name is Cheryl Bowler. I'm from Voluntary Partners. In your program, it says Hartree Partners. There is a relationship between those two companies. Voluntary Partners is the wholly owned subsidiary of Hartree Partners. We do a end-to-end solution of carbon. We develop and finance projects. We trade in carbon. We provide carbon advisory, and we supply long-term to end users. With me today, I have a wonderful panel of mostly women. Poor Ben, he's here on his own, but this is fantastic, and I think a good reflection of how the real world in carbon is looking. So, and our topic of how Asia can balance economic growth, energy needs with climate change goals is a challenging one, and we know that they usually give women the challenging roles. So, very appropriate panel today. We're going to start with Ermi Miao. Ermi is the analyst from the Environment and Climate Change Unit at the International Energy Agency. So please welcome Ermi.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks Cheryl for the introduction and IETA for the great organization. So I'm here today to give a scene-setting presentation on the new World's Energy Outlook 2022. So we're currently experiencing the first truly global energy shock. Oil and gas markets are experiencing a huge amount of uncertainty, and the crisis is causing severe damage to the global economy. It is also exacerbating pre-existing inflationary pressures. With rising food and energy prices, it is the vulnerable that are suffering the most. For the first time in decades, the number of people around the world without access to electricity is set to rise in 2022. And this lead to one of the key questions in this year's World's Energy Outlook. Will the current energy crisis be a help or a hindrance to move towards a more sustainable and resilient energy system? The response of policymakers will be crucial, and our outlook considers a number of different scenarios on how things could emerge in the futures. None of those are meant to be a forecast, but include different assumptions on how governments respond and policy change in the future. Here we'll see the picture for clean energy investments, including renewable power, nuclear, clean fuels, grids and storage, efficiency EVs, and so on. For the 5 years after the Paris Agreement, global clean energy investment growth is rather modest. Falling costs for some key technologies means that this money went further each year, but this was far from enough to get on track for the aim of the Paris Agreement. Only in 2021, we see the first jump as countries out of COVID crisis started putting in place sustainable recovery. On the evidence so far, the response for policymakers to the energy crisis is to turbocharge clean energy investments through new policies and measures, such as Japan's Green Transformation Program, India making further progress towards its domestic renewable targets. By 2030, annual clean energy investment rises above $2 trillion per year. However, two points to highlight though. This increase is not big enough for achieving net zero. For net zero to happen, we need investments to be $4 trillion in 2030. And that second part, the largest share of the increase in investment is concentrated in advanced economies, followed by China. There is a lot of work to do to increase the pace of investment in emerging and developing economies. Now we're taking an example of the Southeast Asia. Based on our Southeast Asia Energy Outlook published this May, to implement the stated policies, the energy investment needs to be almost double in the region by 2030. And to deliver on the Paris Agreement goal, it needs to be almost triple, and with a share of clean energy investment reaching 80%. To mobilize this massive amount of investment, it is extremely important to show clear policy message and to improve energy regulatory and cross-cutting financing frameworks. International development finance has also a key role to catalyze private funds. Millie from the panel will touch more on renewables in Southeast Asia in the panel later on. And next on electricity. Electricity is turning the corner. Renewable continue to grow, but a difficult year for nuclear power and natural gas generation, hit by very high prices and energy security concerns. This has led to a rise to coal-fired power plant in Europe and continued growth in Asia. However, the global rise in coal is temporary as stronger policies drive up renewables. By 2025, global coal-fired generation is lower than it was in 2021. By 2030, coal-fired power plant and total coal use are down by about 10% comparing with 2021 level. More broadly, coal shows a more sustained rise only in a few fast-growing countries and regions, notably India and Southeast Asia. Renewables will be up 90% with solar PV and wind growing in markets around the world. Combined with growth for nuclear power, low-emission resources of electricity surpass the output for fossil fuels by 2030. And this means today we're already around the peak for global power sector emissions. Advanced economies lead the way, continue reductions that started a decade ago, while emerging markets and developing economies peak emission before 2030. And a word about fossil fuels. For the first time, today's policy settings are strong enough to generate an overall peak in fossil fuel demand before the end of the decade. Along with a plateau in gas demand, coal demand peak within the next few years, and oil demand reaches a high point in the mid-2030s before falling back slightly. Fossil fuel use and the emissions from their combustion has risen every decade since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So, all of our scenarios now have a growing global economy and a growing energy demand alongside a reduced role for fossil fuels in meeting all those needs. That is a pivotal moment in energy history. And with all that said, what does this mean for emissions? Emissions have risen steadily over recent decades. Prior to the signature of Paris Agreement, our baseline expectation was that they would continue to do so, putting us on track for a really catastrophic 3.5 degree rise in long-term average temperature. But we now see a different picture emerging in the energy sector. Thanks to the improvement in key technologies and policies, this has shaved 1 degree off in projected long-term warming compared to our pre-Paris baseline. But can we reduce the temperature rise more and keep it within the 1.5 degree limit? That will be a much tougher task. But if all governments follow through and implement their NDCs and net zero pledges in full and on time, and if companies follow through on their own commitments, the announced pledges scenario puts us on track for a global temperature rise of 1.7 degree. We recognize that this is a big if, and we cannot really take that for granted. But, as you can see, the pathway to get emissions down to zero by 2050 and limit warming to 1.5 degree require even faster transition. In conclusion, today's energy crisis reminds us both of the fragility of the current energy system and also why it is critical to press ahead with clean energy transition and the importance of making change inclusive, affordable, and secure. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you, and I pass the floor back to Cheryl.
Thanks, Ermi, for that enlightening introduction. Ermi has travelled all the way from Paris to bring us this wonderful news. So, moving on to Millie Fomakov from Imperial College London, where she is a researcher. We're going to have a little bit more information on renewable energy.
Cheryl, good afternoon, everyone. Millie Fomakov from Imperial College London, the Center for Climate Finance and Investment, where I lead our renewable power pricing research efforts with Ermi's colleagues from the International Energy Agency. So how can Asia balance economic growth, energy needs, and climate change goals? So to tackle all three objectives, we need to think about return-yielding investments that also lead to much higher energy supply and that also lead to systemic decarbonization. So we will focus on the renewable power sector globally and in Southeast Asia. So the International Energy Agency and our center have been spending several years together and actually looking at the power sector, both fossil fuels and renewables, and how they perform globally across different macroeconomic cycles. And we are doing that to provide more transparency and data that will help both policymakers and financial institutions play a more critical role in the energy transition. And we're happy to report that globally, renewables outperformed fossil fuels and their the parent infrastructure benchmark index quite substantially. This is over the last 5 years and over the last 10 years. Also, in Southeast Asia, we do see quite strong returns from renewable power, and we are looking at in comparison to the broader infrastructure index here in the region. Although we are seeing really strong returns globally with really low volatility, here in the region, we are seeing slightly patchy return streams. It's not always consistent, but we can see very high returns across some countries. Most of our data here comes from the Philippines because most assets that are available to study actually are concentrated in this country. There are a lot more assets, however, we don't have enough data and a lot of reporting, so we're spending some time here in Singapore looking for some data points, so if you do have any, do reach out. And also, we have, through some conversations with our investors and with our partners across multiple geographies in multiple countries, actually here in the region, we have observed some target IRRs, return on investment, of roughly 9 to 12%, which is quite attractive and sometimes in line with some global trends. So despite the fact that we do see very decent performance profile and very good rate of returns, we do not see enough investment in this region. And Ermi has highlighted where do we need to go in terms of what's the overall investment level here in the region to reach some decarbonization goals. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is not even a third of that. So in Southeast Asia, average annual investments of 7 billion are actually some of the lowest globally, apart from sub-Saharan Africa. And most of these investments have been mobilized in Vietnam. So this significant increase in 2020 and then the subsequent decrease is primarily driven by one country, and that is Vietnam. A lot of investments have gone into that region, and there was a lot of new capacity added before the expiration of their tariff scheme. And since then, we have seen this really sharp drop. We need more foreign investments because here, over the last 5 years, only 50 to 60% have been driven by the private sector and not enough by foreign investors. So we need to think about mobilizing more foreign private investments to reach some kind of levels that we're seeing globally, which Very frequently in renewable energy in developed markets, that is roughly 80 to 90%. So how can we actually mobilize more capital from foreign investors? This is where carbon markets come in. In addition to carbon markets being used to both nudge certain behaviors and as part of the reward system, they can also be used as to contribute to some risk mitigation mechanisms. We know that a lot of foreign investors, big pension funds in Europe, in the US, in Japan, can take a lot of illiquidity risk. They're able to invest in infrastructure because they have this really long-term time horizon, which is very much in line with the duration of some renewable projects, but given to some regulatory risks, credit risk, currency risk, and small ticket sizes, they're simply not going into this region. And there's one risk factor, which is currency risk, that is really significant because most big pools of institutional capital cannot take that kind of volatility profile. So there's this really wonderful proposal that this is a concept developed by several researchers at the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and Columbia University. And they came with this concept of this exchange-traded facility where there will be 3 tranches of risk mitigation. The first tranche, in terms of local currency devaluation relative to some hard currencies that investors, that is their base currency, that first level of losses could be mitigated by this first tranche that is based on carbon credits. The second would be covered by the multilateral institutions, and the third by private investors and philanthropies. But this first tranche could be covered by carbon credits issued by solar and wind developers. And that is how carbon credits can really come in and not just serve a single purpose, but actually unlock a lot of institutional foreign capital for many sectors, including the renewable power segment. So really to add to their mandate in terms of all wonderful objectives that they have, one would be risk mitigation and unlocking capital for other sectors by being used in this tiered system of risk mitigation. Thank you.
Thanks, Millie. And now I'll call on Lee Levkovitz to talk about what is happening at BHP, where she is head of energy, carbon and technology.
Thanks, Cheryl. I might sit here because I don't have a formal presentation, so we'll make this a little bit more informal. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me on the panel. Cyril earlier talked a little bit about BHP, but I'll give everyone a little bit of a rundown of kind of our perspective on the market and how we think about this enormous challenge ahead of us. So BHP is, of course, a very large mining company based in Australia. And so when we think about decarbonization, carbon markets, et cetera, we think about it from a number of different angles, right? So of course we have our own scope 1 and 2 emissions. We are, in the mining sector, which is a hard to abate sector. We have very robust targets in the near term, so out to 2030, 30% reduction by 2030, and a very concrete plan on how to get there. So we prioritize structural abatement in order to reduce those emissions, including through a variety of power PPAs and renewables PPAs, as well as working with kind of some of our manufacturing suppliers for things like electrified mining trucks and those kinds of things. So we have a very detailed plan. So we're not hugely involved in the carbon market space in order to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions at the moment. But I think where we are incredibly qualified to answer some of these questions is from our value chain. So around 80% of the commodities that we produce actually go into Asia. And around 70% of our revenue is from iron ore and metallurgical coal sales, which go into the steel sector. So if I think about those two things, we are selling into arguably the hardest to abate region in the world, and we are selling commodities into arguably the hardest to abate end-use sector in the world, right? And so it's a very unique perspective on how does Asia decarbonize? How do we get to that last mile decarbonization? How do we get to net zero? And, we've learned a lot in this process, particularly as we are engaging our customers. We obviously have our hands around the scope 1 and 2 problem, but the scope 3 problem is enormous, as we just mentioned. So we're working really closely, particularly with our steel customers, to figure out how do we get them to net zero, hopefully by 2050. That is our long-term goal, to get to scope 3 emissions, to get to net zero by 2050. And one of the things that we've really learned is Asia is not Europe. I think that probably comes as no surprise to everyone in this room, particularly if you are in Asia. But, it might sound obvious, but Asia is obviously a developing region, right? And there are many countries in this region that are still trying to lift their populations out of poverty. And so if we think about the challenges at hand, so for example, India, we think that India, by the time they get to 2050, they're going to increase steel production 4 times from today. And that's not happening in 2040, right? That's happening today, and in 2030, and in 2035. And that means they can't sit around and wait until we have the, beautiful hydrogen DRI facility and green end state steelmaking technology in order to get there. They're essentially putting on whatever is the most efficient steel plant in the market today, which is a blast furnace. That blast furnace is going to stay online for 40 or 50 years. So the typical lifetime of a blast furnace to make steel is 50 years. So if they put that on today, we need to figure out a way to start decarbonizing that existing capital stock now and into 2030, et cetera. And so that's a different type of financing challenge. It's a different type of carbon market solution. It's very different than in Europe, where the average plant is today around 45 years old, right? So ready to retire, ready to invest in some of these newer green end state technologies. And so these are some of the challenges that we're working through with our customers to say, okay, well, how can we utilize your existing capital stock and maybe retrofit that, or try to increase efficiencies using high quality raw materials, et cetera, to reduce emissions kind of in that transition stage as we go to the green end state that we're all kind of looking for. So that's, I think, the first point. The other point is beyond kind of the capital stock question, which I think is an enormous question that we all need to contend with. The other point is there are a number of unique kind of geographic challenges in this region that, again, Europe doesn't necessarily need to contend with. So if I think about Japan, or if I think about Singapore, right, there's obviously enormous land use challenges when it comes to decarbonizing. Similarly, a lot of these countries in the regions are not interconnected like you would see in Europe. And so that makes challenges around decarbonization of the power sector much more difficult, of course. So if I link all of those kind of challenges back to carbon markets, which is, I think, why everyone is here, I think there are enormous opportunities, both on the supply side as well as the demand side, for carbon credits to deal with some of those challenges. So on the supply side, as I spoke about, very hard to abate sector. There will be remaining emissions in a lot of these sectors for quite some time. And they will need financing in order to deal with some of these challenges, right? This is going to be expensive. We need investment. We need money coming into this region in order to deal with that. And then, of course, on the demand side, these emissions will be around for a long time, and therefore there will probably be large purchasers of carbon offsets for quite some time going forward as well. So that's kind of the way that we're thinking about how to engage with this market, how to work with our customers to do that. And in order to do that, we're kind of actively partnering with our customers, but we're also trying to enable the carbon markets ecosystem to ensure that when it comes time, not just for BHP, post 2030 to get into this market and deal with some of our harder to abate emissions, but when our customers are looking to to start to reduce their emissions as well, that there is enough depth and transparency and integrity in the carbon markets that they are able to meet those challenges.
Thanks, Lee. And lastly to Ben, who is all about carbon markets. Ben is the Chief Commercial Officer at Expansive, and they are doing their best to enable free and liquid and deep trading in the carbon market.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, IETA, for putting on the event. Yeah, look, I think our point of view is we provide market infrastructure to help these markets evolve. And, you know, they're very early stage markets. They're taking a long time to get liquid and up and running. And I think they've come an extremely long way in the last 2 years. I mean, they're not a new thing. Carbon markets have been around for 2 decades. So I think the focus on them in the last 2 years has been quite significant. And I think the flow of capital into those markets in the last 2 years has been equally significant. And so I think we are seeing that transition and the carbon market playing a significant role, providing price signals to enable investment to come into a lot of these assets that generate ultimately carbon assets in the form of carbon offsets, renewable energy certificates and other environmental-based commodities that are, I think, are the backbone of the market's infrastructure that is going to help with the transition. So we're very excited to be at the forefront of that and helping to provide that infrastructure. And I think it's a very exciting time in the region to be getting engaged in the markets, and we foresee a lot of growth in this area for a long time to come. So I won't take up too much time. I'll let the questions come now, and we'll go from there.
Great, thanks, Ben. So I've just got a question for the panellists, particularly Millie and Urmi, on renewable energy. So we know renewable energy is going to be an integral transition for Asia, but unfortunately, under the 2 main standards, Gold Standard and Verra, renewable energy is not eligible generally for carbon credits. And renewable energy certificates out of countries like Vietnam and India are trading at a very low price. So how can carbon facilitate a market that doesn't seem to want it?
Of course. Thanks, Cheryl. So in terms of, how can it facilitate in this market that doesn't seem to want it? Well, what's really great is that actually the renewable power can, even without carbon markets, to a certain extent, operate in such a way that does deliver good returns and actually is a very investable market. I think there are, of course, limits, given what you just said, to how big of a role can carbon markets play in this market that doesn't seem to want it. But they could actually be partially used through this mechanism that I just explained, where they do have this partial risk mitigating role, where they the entire performance of this sector relies on carbon credits, but it could be aided by that. So I think in a limited capacity, even if they're not as broadly adopted, they can still, in a very concentrated and a specific way, play a minor role that would unlock this massive flow of capital, then will kind of do its own work.
I guess on this point, my line of work, I work more on the domestic market, and we see a lot of interest in Asia for establishing its own domestic carbon market, for example, for China ETS, and we saw India is establishing a cap and trade and tax, and there's also interest from India, from Vietnam. So in a ways, I think some of those systems set, for example, in Indonesia, in some of the draft proposal, renewables, even with the current design of a benchmark setting, that renewables could be used to help coal power plant to offset some of the emissions allowance. So in a way that it's not directly playing to the market, but it's also have a use in their domestic markets.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I think the markets are going through evolutions. I mean, if you look at carbon markets, you went back 4 years ago, and anyone who's been around long enough to know what the prices were like back then, you know that this is not a new thing. Carbon credits were trading for 30 cents. And it was a market that, didn't seem to want it. So I think it's just the timing issue is probably the key thing from the market perspective. I think there's a lot of policy-driven activity that's going to help mature the market. And to Millie's point, I think we're going through extremely high power prices pretty much globally at the moment. So they're standing on their own 2 feet for now, but they won't always be there. So I think the market has a role to play, but I think it's just a timing issue. So yeah, it's not that long ago that carbon was in a similar spot. So.
Okay. So Lee, just to turn carbon on its head for a minute, the current method of reduce and then do as much as you can internally before you look at offsets as the very last resort, would it be worth switching that around to say offset everything, and then you're incentivized to then do all the things you need to do internally, not just have an internal carbon price, put an external carbon price internally?
Yeah, interesting thought experiment. I think we are prioritizing kind of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, of decarbonization at our assets, because not only is it the right thing to do, but in many instances we're actually getting preferable commercial outcomes as a result of that. So for example, our Chilean assets are going to be running on 100% renewable power by the mid-2020s for our copper producing mines. And by the way, we're also going to be paying less for that than we would have been if we were using gas-fired power, right, which we were using previously. So I think there's a lot of opportunities kind of to internally abate and then also seek, win-win outcomes in order to make this happen. So, when I think about BHP's emissions, we have kind of the power emissions, the scope 2 emissions, which are kind of the 40% in the beginning. And those, some are more challenging than others. So the Chilean ones, as I just spoke about, we've managed to sign a PPA for 100%. But we also have assets in the Pilbara in Western Australia, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere. It looks like Mars over there. So obviously that's a lot more difficult because you're not in an interconnected grid, for example. The next 40% after that are diesel emissions. So a huge part about mining is basically just digging up a ton of dirt and moving it around. And these are massive, massive trucks, right? And so we need to figure out how we can reduce the emissions from the diesel that's running on these trucks. That's a bit harder. Today, there are not really available technology solutions in order to reduce those emissions. And so we have to work a lot more closely with our OEMs in order to figure out, okay, can we electrify these trucks? How does that come online over time? And we think we do have a solution to those. So that's kind of your 40%. And then we're left with the remaining 20%, which is kind of the hardest to abate of the mixed. And so, that's all kind of happening all at once. There'll be a bit of a timeline to it. And I think we'll go to the offset market to kind of smooth that transition in that process. But really, we want to make sure by the time we get to that last 20% that there is a market out there that is deep enough, that is transparent, that it has high integrity, that we can be a part of that. And so the way that we're acting on that is from a number of perspectives, but I think we're trying to kind of get the demand side right, and so that's kind of being involved in the conversation around what some of these standards and integrity measures should be. But it's also on getting the supply side right. And so, for example, we're working with Australia's CSIRO to find new blue carbon methodologies in order to kind of spur the market with different types of methodologies. In addition to that, it's looking in our own backyard, right? So mineral carbonation is a real focus for us as a company now. So at our Nickel West asset and also in Western Australia, we've started looking into our tailings, right? So what are our tailings from mining? How are they actually absorbing CO2, currently? And we did a study on this, and we realized that just without doing anything, these tailings are already absorbing around 40,000 tons of CO2 per year, which is kind of incredible, right? And that same study showed that this could potentially be scaled up to 4 million tons per year of carbon reductions. Of course, that would require investment, and it requires kind of heating up the tailings and ensuring that they're able to do that through a chemical reagent process. But we're now looking into methodologies to help us actually incentivize doing that, right? So some of those things on the supply side are helping us kind of do all of this at once, but it's very difficult to do it all right now because there's just not enough supply in the market in order to make that happen.
Okay, well, we've got about 20 minutes left, so I'd actually like to now invite questions from the room, because I don't have all the questions, and I'm sure some of you have some good ones for our panel here. Any hands? Yes. Can we get a microphone?
Yeah, hi. My question is to Lee.
Sorry, can you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. I'm Nikunj Nangalia. I represent the international business team from Renewable Power. We are India's largest clean energy solutions provider. So my question is to Lee. When you are told that you are looking at low-hanging fruits in order to decarbonize your entire Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, so can you explain more what are those low-hanging fruits?
So when I say low-hanging fruit, it's essentially Scope 2 is probably the lowest of the hanging fruits, right? So that's kind of decarbonizing our power purchases. And so to that end, we've signed a host of PPAs in Australia as well as Chile, as I mentioned before. We just about a month ago signed another PPA for our Olympic Dam asset in South Australia to purchase the equivalent of around 50% of our electricity purchases by the time we get to the mid-2020s from wind and batteries. And so that's kind of the low-hanging fruit, if you will. So where there are available solutions today in order for us to decarbonize internally. The harder parts are where there are no solutions yet. That's where we really need to work with our value chain. And that's actively happening. And so that's working with OEMs on the trucks in order to decarbonize those. And then it's also, when we think about Scope 3, how we're going to help our customers reduce emissions over time in some of these very, very hard to abate sectors.
Any other questions from the room? No.
I've got one for Lee.
Okay.
Sure.
Sorry, Lee, can you just clarify when you said that there's not enough supply in the market? There's a lot of people in this room who'd probably be very happy to help you there. What were you referring to?
Sorry, when I mean not enough supply, I mean by the time that we need the supply, so post 2030, when everyone is going to be ramping up purchases of carbon offsets, our projection are that there potentially won't be enough supply of high quality products on the market for us to purchase. And so we want to make sure that as that demand gets built up, that supply is kind of keeping pace with that demand.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've got another question then for my renewable energy ladies. We're still seeing coal-fired power stations being built in Asia. How do we stop this happening with carbon?
With carbon, I guess also coming from a domestic compliance carbon market point of view. So from that, we do see that the ETS or carbon tax could play a role, but it's very early on. But so from how carbon pricing was cap or with intensity benchmark set, it will make a coal-fired plant to be less economically attractive. And with that also send a really clear policy signals about long-term trajectory of a power sector. So for many of the Asia market, it's quite regulated. So in that sense, a very clear policy signals would go for a long way to deter new construction of coal-fired power plants.
So you're saying in these particularly state-owned monopoly power markets, we need more government intervention?
Not particularly, but I guess with several of the more state-owned, with more heavily regulated, there is a limit. I guess a limitation with how the carbon credits can play. But it's also, I personally look more into how on the policy and on the domestic market side could help. But they can all work together to decarbonize. So maybe I'll pass Millie to talk more on the voluntary market side.
Sure. So, to echo what Emily just said, we need really a combination of factors to really go from coal to renewables. And she mentioned some fiscal measures. Until, we have as much government funding for coal, it's going to be really difficult to have this really rapid transition. So how then how can carbon markets really step in? And that would be through, first is, carbon taxes, one, but, kind of core compliance or voluntary markets when it comes to, cap and trade, the best way is to make certain activities uneconomical. So in addition to introducing compliance markets and, this cap and trade scheme, we need to think about, some market mechanisms that really lead to the kind of pricing that they really deter new capex going into this sector. And we really need to kind of also think about, some orderly transition pathways, because we don't want any kind of situation where a lot of people are without electricity. So some stepwise processes through carbon compliance market mechanisms that are pricing related, that are really leading to this orderly decommissioning by making new capex really uneconomical. When it comes to voluntary markets, I would say, their role in this really significant transition is quite limited, unless they're able to be used for this massive pool of capital to go straight into renewables, so they can ramp up, their new capacity and reach, some stated goals much earlier. And then it's a lot easier when you have that added capacity to start decommissioning at a much more rapid pace. But I do think that their role is quite limited relative to compliance markets.
Yeah, so it's a combination of carrot and stick, and a bit like the Singapore model where we have a tax and voluntary carbon. How realistic is it that we expect these governments to implement such a thing and then deploy the revenue in a complementary fashion? Maybe a rhetorical question.
I think coal phase out in a lot of the emerging market, need a lot of investments. So one example I can think is the Indonesia's new jet piece, which is a massive investment that focus on coal phase out. So I think a lot of money and the capital need to flow in order to help with the transition to phase out coal power plants.
So just going a bit further out. Oh, you have a question from the room? Sorry, I didn't see. Yes.
We have been arguing about renewables and power situation. This year, Europe is facing unprecedented issue about power situation. Europe moved to renewable many years back, and now the gas supply is not there, and suddenly the economies have realized that you can't 100% rely on the renewables. So how to address that? I mean, it's very easy to say that everything should move to renewable, but it is practically possible.
System stability is key. So anyone, any takers?
I can cover that. It's a process. So I would argue that a lot of the challenges that Europe is going through right now are not because of renewables, it's because of gas-fired power as opposed to renewables. I mean, it's a gas supply crunch, not necessarily a renewables crunch. But that's not to say there won't be challenges, right? So, particularly as we add continuous amounts of variable renewable capacity onto the grid, the more that increases, the bigger the challenges are, right? And so we need to ensure that there are kind of integrated stability and flexibility solutions in order to enable that. And that comes with a lot of different ways, right? You can have interconnected grids, you can have storage, you can have, capacity markets. There's a whole host of ways that we can deal with those challenges. And many markets around the world have already proven that they can deal with very high levels of variable renewable penetration, including in Australia, right? So that's a market that we care about a lot. Australia has its own challenges sometimes, but I think those are solvable solutions, but it requires kind of an entire value chain approach to thinking about those solutions. So not just governments thinking through this, but also, from upstream suppliers all the way downstream to the users of power to kind of work together to solve those challenges.
I'd also like to say that batteries are going to play an increasingly important role. We're seeing now the development of commercial megawatt scale battery installations being deployed into decommissioned coal-fired power station sites. And these are commercial. These aren't done by any state-owned entity. But that also has to happen in a market that encourages the investment at scale and doesn't present barriers to the deployment of such technologies. I think Ben's got a comment too.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think the infrastructure is a holistic solution, and I think storage is going to play a huge key. And I think it's a bit of a misconception to say that Europe's gone to renewables. They're still transitioning as well. They're not there yet, and they've still been taking gas-fired power stations. Nuclear's been there for a long time as well. There's a lot of other power sources. So I think everywhere is still in transition. Some are a little bit further up the curve than others, but no one's got the whole solution yet. So I think it's still just an evolution.
To add, we kind of think about reliability. I would say, when it comes to renewables, it's about intermittency, they're not unreliable. And as Lim, mentioned, it's not that, Europe has been going in this direction that caused this issue. So I think really we really need more grid flexibility as we are transitioning. And if there are supply side shocks from one single fuel source, some, flexible grids could absorb that. So it's not that renewables caused this issue. Actually, if we ramped up, their capacity even more, we would be facing fewer issues in this gas supply side crunch.
Oh yes, in the front here. Please introduce yourself when you ask your question.
Hi, I'm Cheryl from Bloomberg. This question is directed at Ben because I think it's more relevant to his work with the exchange. So firstly, what's the outlook for 2023 for the markets, and what really needs to happen, you think, for there to be even more trading volume and greater effectiveness in curbing emissions from credits?
Look, I think the market has, taken a big shock, as most markets have, as a result of conflict in Europe, inflationary issues. I think part of the issue is, especially if you're talking specifically about the voluntary market, is that it doesn't have an end date. There's no real time pressure. There's, 2025 is kind of the earliest net zero commitments. 2030, as Lee's mentioning, that's kind of like a watermark date. So there's this constant view that can continue to be pushed out and dealt with later. And so as we get closer to those dates, I think you'll see, as Lee rightly pointed out, people will be coming to market and looking to source credits to meet those requirements, and that will drive, more volume and higher prices. But I think, in this whole period, our perspective is that the investment into the project level activities has not slowed down at all. There's many people are investing in origination of projects. Some types of origination has slowed, probably namely the renewables, so it probably doesn't help this conversation a lot. But, in forestry-based projects, in blue carbon projects, the amount of cook stove and sort of socially orientated projects is going through the roof, and there's a huge amount of volume coming down the pipeline for those. So, I think, no one has a crystal ball, especially us, but I think, the outlook is, we think that volumes did rebound in the back half of this year. It was a very quiet period between April and July. And then we did see volumes come back up in sort of August, which is traditionally a slow month, because everyone's on holidays in Northern Hemisphere. But that's generally now picked up, and we're sort of getting back to economic downturn volumes in the market. So I think, the market is continuing to grow. I think there'll be a bit of growth this year as an overall number compared to last year. Not hugely, but I think the outlook is looking more positive in the medium term. And I think it's for a few of those reasons. There is no real time pressure within the voluntary market that forces people to do things. But, Corsair is coming closer to having to meet its obligations. And there's a lot of other industry-based programs that are trying to ramp up net zero commitments. All of these things are sort of coming to a head, all in pretty similar timeframes. So, while the immediate term may not look super rosy, I think, in the sort of 12 to 24 month timeframe, I think, markets will rebound quite significantly.
Any more questions in the room? Oh.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Dorji Sun. I'm CEO of Bioeconomy, which is a large-scale nature-based solutions project developer. My first COP was COP13 in 2007, and it's refreshing to see some old faces in the room. My question is actually, obviously the elephant in the room is the fact that we were 1.2 degrees warming, and at 1.5 degrees we've got, some climate tipping points which come into play. As a project developer, I think stabilization of demand is a hugely important thing. And I note that many companies during the Glasgow period would retire, but then after Glasgow, some of them have stopped retiring. There hasn't been necessarily consistency. And what we found for guys like me who have been in the market since 06, 07, is after Copenhagen became Hopenhagen and everything kind of slowed down, and the economic GFC, etc., allowed for an economic justification for pullback on retirements and a pullback on demand. My question really would be, can we create a not negative but positive way to crowd in voluntary buyers to consistently buy and retire without being hit over the head by integrity hawks? So as a broad question, it's kind of touching upon integrity becoming perfect being the enemy of good, us needing liquidity and movement, and then needing consistency of buying and retirement, so we know that even if there is another energy crisis, even if there is another GFC, we keep moving forward as a market and as an industry together. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's a really good question, and integrity came up in the previous session, and it's an ongoing issue for us in the market. We see that these projects are really high quality, but the amount of negative press being given to companies for doing anything, even if they are doing something good, is quite disheartening, because the reality is, without doing that, then what are they doing? They're doing nothing. So I feel like the green groups that are anti-offset at the moment are doing the world more harm than good with their rhetoric. But there is the conflation of the issue of offsetting as a permit to pollute and offsetting as an instrument for good. So I invite the panel to make any further comments on that.
I could make a comment. I always just like to think about the accounting, like the global carbon budget accounting, to drive home this point. We're at 40.6 gigatons of emissions, right, every year. We're still increasing. So this year we will have increased another 1%. And that's with China lockdowns, that's with, global economic headwinds, inflationary headwinds, et cetera. We're still increasing, right, by 1%. If we think about that 40.6 gigatons, 6.5 gigatons of that is from deforestation. Every year is from deforestation, right? So we can't get ahead of ourselves into thinking, okay, we need just negative emissions, we need, direct air capture technology solutions. We need to stop that hole, that 6.5 gigaton hole, And so if there are, solutions out there in which we can do that today, I think that that's really important from a supply perspective. So let's not run before we start walking, right? We need to stop that tap from increasing, and then we need to get the water out of the tub before we get ahead of ourselves. So I agree. I think there is a sense of urgency there, which is why we're not slowing down and waiting for all of these integrity issues to be solved. We are getting into the market, dipping our toes in the water, but prioritizing internal abatement where we can, right? Really trying to reduce emissions anywhere we can, embedding it into the wiring of our company in order to make that happen. And taking action to make sure that carbon credits are available when we need them in the 2030s.
Yeah, I think integrity is a buzzword at the moment that seems to be sort of strangling the market. I think I think we always need to have a lot of vigilance when it comes to project development. It is an iterative process. It's never been sort of stagnant. If you go back to when all of these solutions started in the early 2000s, they've always evolved. That's why the methodologies have a number next to them. It's 3 dot something, and there are multiple variations of them. And so I think the market is continually evolving. So I think the fact that it's always going to be like that sort of process, and I think we should never endeavour to stop trying to evolve it. I think that would be a bad move to do in terms of integrity for the market. But I think to the point that everyone's sort of making, that I think there's a lot of negative noise around what the current market is doing and the current credits, and we've talked about having to have investment into Asia and China, yet those renewable energy certificates are the ones that people say, oh well, they've got bad integrity. So you can't sort of complain about it on one hand and then say that they've got bad integrity on the other. It's kind of and not sort of a helpful solution. So I think the sooner we get past this integrity issue into just driving forward with the market, it will always be evolving, it'll always be changing, the better for everyone, and the market will just be able to get on and do what it needs to do, and companies will be able to invest with comfort around the offsets they're getting, and retirements will go up. And I think that's sort of hopefully where we'll get to in the near future. But this isn't the first time we've had this issue, so the market will weather this storm again and continue. But I think it is a little bit overinflated, the issues around integrity.
Yeah, so let's hope that 6.2 and 6.4 give us some sort of government oversight certainty that prevents some of these claims of greenwashing and gives us a robust system under which we can actively retire and talk loudly, not green hushing, about what we're achieving with these carbon markets. I realise we're at time, so I'd like to thank all my panellists here today, and please join me in thanking them.